Moving on, our bloated public service is on track for yet another victory under this new socialist government. Research from the Taxpayers Alliance shows us that our civil servants are on track to receive gold-plated pensions, which are remarkable 4 times nearly higher than those who work in the private sector. The research shows that those in the private sector can expect annual pensions worth around £7,000, whilst those on the same salary in the public sector will earn £7,000. So it's 26,000 versus 7,000. So what's happening here? Are these pensions a deserved reward for those who have spent their career in public service, or are they an unsustainable burden which could bankrupt Britain? Well, I'm joined now by a friend of the programme, Elliot Kirk, Head of Campaigns at Taxpayers Alliance. Now, Elliot, you're a hard-nosed man, aren't you? These hard-working civil servants, they toil away. Yeah. They're working in their offices night and day, burning the midnight oil, and at the end of it, on a low wage, they get a little bit of a pension. Yes,
this is the perception that the public sector likes to put forward, and certain parts of the media and the political class like to put forward. It would have been a perception that you would have dealt with in government. Actually, the reality is that in the public sector, they work fewer hours on average than the private sector. They have more annual leave. They have higher pay, more sick leave, and of course greater job security. And anyone that's worked in the private sector knows the value of job security. And on top of that, they get access to a pension scheme that is now essentially inaccessible to new entrants into the private sector. Only 1.5% of new entrants to the private sector get access to this specific pension scheme that the public sector get access to.
What do you mean by this specific pension scheme?
Yeah, so this is the difference between what's called a defined benefit pension scheme and a defined contribution pension scheme. So in both, the employer and the employee pays money into a pot. Of course, actually in the public sector, there is no pot in reality, but let's imagine there is for the moment. When you retire, if you're on a defined pension scheme, it doesn't matter how much you've actually put into that pot, you have a guaranteed pension at the end of it. It's often called a final salary pension, and in the public sector, that looks like 70% roughly of your final salary or your average salary. That means no matter how much money you've actually put in, you have that guaranteed amount. In the private sector, your pension is only based on how much you've put in, how much your employer has put in, and then how well that has done over
That's the defined contribution. So you make a contribution. Now, we used to have a lot of defined benefit pensions in the private sector. In the 80s and 90s, they were hugely overfunded as well. Yeah. But Gordon Brown smashed them, didn't he?
Well, he did, absolutely. But listen, the other thing we have to remember is those defined pension schemes, now that people are living much, much longer, actually are basically unaffordable. And there's a reason why so few companies provide them anymore.
Well, isn't it also interest rates, that interest rates fell to the lowest level in history?
Which makes it difficult to grow the size of your pension pot.
And that rising interest rates has made pensions more affordable. So that will have eased some of the pressure on defined benefit pensions, but they've now faded out. As you say, very few new entrants in the private sector.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really interesting, and you never know, maybe that point on rising interest rates means they will start to be brought back in some areas of the private sector. That would be interesting. But we should remember that in the private sector, they will still to some extent be funded. You will be putting money into an investment scheme that will then grow, and yes, it may then be topped up at the end. That's not what happens in the public sector. It all just goes, with the exception of local government, straight into the Treasury, and then at some point the Treasury pays it out of future taxpayers' money.
And this is where it is as good as gold, because the pension in the public sector is like government debt, that it will always be redeemed. Whereas in the private sector, if your company goes bankrupt, you have to fall on the pensions regulator, your pension is cut.
Yeah, and you'll be in serious trouble, and that speaks to this point about job security. People in the public sector have a range of perks that simply those don't in the private sector. And Rachel Reeves is talking about the state of the public finances, and rightly, we know from our Taxpayers Alliance's debt clock that debt is increasing by £4,410 per second. If you really want to deal with the public finances, you're going to have to start moving public sector workers onto a more realistic scheme.
And in terms of what many people believe, that, and you mentioned this earlier, that people in the public sector earn less during their careers. Is that still true in the work you've done?
It's not true. No, people in the public, obviously in the private sector, there is a range of jobs at the top which have salaries and bonuses and all the rest of it that people in the public sector are never going to achieve. But if you look at not just average salaries, but if you look at comparable roles around the middle of the pack in the public and private sector, in the public sector, you're paid slightly more.
But you don't get bonuses in the way. So is this including bonuses?
I think it's excluding bonuses. And yes, bonuses generally haven't been provided in the public sector in recent years, but they are now starting to be brought back in. There was a brilliant story last week that the director of the Border Force got a £20,000 bonus in one single year. The what is not entirely clear.
Well, because he's been so successful in bringing more people into this country.
Well, yeah, maybe that's the metric.
No doubt met his targets.
Yeah.
But to come back to this point of the overall effect, what is the total pension fund liability sitting on the state on top of the national debt?
Well, so the problem is it's not entirely easy to actually calculate, but rough calculations that those that have looked at the OBR, I think, it put it at about 2.8 trillion. It's about the size of the UK national economy, but it could actually end up being higher than that.
So our national debt, gilt-edged securities, is about 2.5 trillion?
Yeah, precisely.
So you've got another 2.7 trillion.
Which isn't accounted for in the national debt, it's separate.
Which is separate on top of that and isn't funded. So if you are a fireman, you pay into your pension fund, but that isn't being put aside for you. That's paying a fireman who retired 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And the public sectors tend also to have low retirement ages.
Yep.
So the cost on the taxpayer is enormous.
Yeah, and there will be a point at which this becomes unaffordable and the system breaks. We know, the Adam Smith Institute have estimated that the state pension will become unaffordable at about 2035 based on the amount of money going into it and the amount of money coming out. And it'll be really interesting. At some point, we will reach breaking point. And what I'd say to Rachel Reeves is she says she's a chancellor that's going to make difficult decisions. OK, if you're going to increase public sector pay, fine, but that means moving them onto a realistic pension scheme that taxpayers can afford.
But it would be very unfair to change the terms and conditions for people who are already working.
It has to be for new entrants.
Has to be new entrants. And is that possible? Is anyone proposing that?
I mean, we're certainly proposing that. We haven't seen that seriously proposed from certainly Labour and even the Conservatives, as far as I'm aware. That's something that simply needs to happen. And if the Chancellor Rachel Reeves wants to be the Chancellor that makes difficult decisions, this is a difficult decision.
But she doesn't, because she's on the side of the public sector. The first thing she's done is boost their pay, which also boosts their pensions, doesn't it? Because they're final salary schemes, so the more their pay rises before they retire, the better off they are.
While at the same time she looks at pension rates on private sector workers, she's looking at cutting the pension tax relief for those on the tax band over £50,000. Same time she's cutting money from pensioners in the winter fuel allowance. So at the same time as she's really hitting people who do the right thing and save money all their lives, who are trying to save money, she's now handing out massive pay rises to public sector workers.
Well, our noble public servants who work so hard to do everything that they do for the country, if only they went into the office. Anyway, thank you very much.